My soul's been anchored in the Lord. In the Lord, in the Lord.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Allison. I'm a student at Martha's Vineyard Regional High School, and I'm very excited to conduct this oral history project with Mr. Jim Thomas. This is a collaboration with Martha's Vineyard branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, the ASALH organization, Martha's Vineyard Regional High School, and Martha's Vineyard Community Television Station, MVTV. We deeply appreciate your time, Mr. Thomas. Thank you so much for being here.
You're quite welcome.
I guess we'll get right into it. Being born in Humboldt, Tennessee in 1939, can you remember the atmosphere? What was it like for the Black community in terms of communication and the struggle for rights?
For Black people in 1939, that whole decade, in a small southern town, it was difficult. The Black community stayed largely by itself. It was segregated. Usually when you hear the words, find the railroad tracks, you could find the railroad tracks in Humboldt, Tennessee. The whites lived on one side, the blacks lived on the other.
Wow.
There would be people who would disappear. Black people would disappear on the weekends. This would happen largely about one guy a week would disappear, and we'd never know what happened to them. But it was assumed that they had been taken away by someone in the white community. You must understand that in that part of the South, I lived not too far away from Pulaski, Tennessee, where many of the Ku Klux Klan units were started. Very, very difficult timing.
Mm-hmm.
And there were still a lot of symbols of the Confederate South that lived, like statues of Robert E. Lee facing south, that kind of thing.
Can you tell us a little bit about your parents' experience in Humboldt, Tennessee?
My parents?
Yeah.
My parents were sharecroppers. My parents, when I was born, they were the farmers. The sharecroppers were farmers who negotiated with the farm owner on crops, and they never did. They never could really settle out even. They would always be owing something more to the farm owner to keep them there. My parents both, quote, graduated, unquote, from the 8th grade, and they were determined. They were both from large families, and they were determined that my sister and I would go to college. We would finish high school, and that we would go to college. Now, this is, keep in mind that when I went to college, it was 1956. So that's a while ago. And they were so determined. I didn't realize at the time how unusual that was. Not just for a black family, but for white families as well. Especially those from small towns in the Deep South. But my parents were determined. That's the one feature that I will always recall and appreciate about them. They said the only thing that separates me from the rest of the world was education. Mm-hmm. And that I would truly have an education. Even when the civil rights movement started, they rushed. I was already in college. They rushed to Fisk to say to me, now there are a lot of things going on out there, but you have to get your education. Your sister and you must finish college. And they were talking of Martin Luther King Jr. came to Fisk to speak. I heard him, and an amazing man. But they said, your reason for being at Fisk is to get an education.
Wow. And what was their avenue of support for their family and their way of dealing with the stress and uncertainty of the time?
There were several things that happened. First of all, they had to be optimistic, mm-hmm. and not hate, because hate can cause you to destroy yourself. So they had to be extremely optimistic, and they were about everything. That helped them to cope. And then they were devout Baptists. The Baptist church in those days was my platform for leadership. Whenever there was a time that a kid was supposed to say something, my parents would push me out front. Go speak, go sing, go do. And they were very supportive. And I know sometimes those speeches must have been terrible, but I would give them, and my parents would congratulate me, and they would, and other members of the church would support me and embrace me. So the black church was very supportive in my upbringing.
Yeah. Your grandmother, Miss Anna Dukes, what was her life like, and how did she impact your chosen career direction?
My great grandmother was Anna Dukes. Mm-hmm. She lived in a log cabin, and she was born a slave. We have been told. We were told by her that she thought she was born in the 1840s. Wow. And she lived well beyond 100. Wow. And I knew her until I was like 13 years old when she died. But she was the first one to tell me about the secret, sacred songs of the enslaved. And I was fascinated, just fascinated, to sit with her while we were either in the log cabin or we would be out fishing. There was a little pond near her log cabin, and we would go there and fish, sometimes actually catch fish. But my great-grandmother was the first one to tell me about the secret, sacred songs and got me really interested in them.
Wow. We know that your grandmother impacted your direction. Did the church also impact your decision to revive the secret, sacred songs?
They supported it.
Oh.
The church supported it. In the 40s, you were not, you couldn't really move ahead, it appeared, if you were looking back. That was the way they saw it. And so they chose to not spend a lot of time looking back. Consequently, I didn't have as much of the history of the old days that I could have had had they not been pushing me forward. Now, I may not have also gotten the education that I got had they not kept pushing me forward as they did. But it was the combination of my great grandmother, the church, my parents, and then there was my music teacher, that my voice teacher, that became a part of the whole picture.
We learned from you that you attended Stigall High School.
Yes.
Can you tell us what your experience was like as a student there?
As a student at Stigall High School was a consolidated school, meaning grades 1 through 12, all in the same building. But Humboldt was a small town, and the black population had its own school, of course, because these were segregated days. I never had a new textbook. The textbooks were sent down from the white high school at the end of their school year and passed on to us. I always welcomed books, but, a new textbook every now and then would have been pleasant. But we never had a new textbook. I had a classical education there. It was one of those things where in my little school, I was able to get a pretty rich high school education, including the study of Latin, which assisted me with my understanding of English. I learned how to decline nouns and conjugate verbs with my study of Latin through the Gallic Wars and Cicero. So I had a very good education. My voice teacher that I met in that school, her father was Mr. Stigall. So the school was named for him. And he had sent his daughter off to college, and she'd gotten a very fine education. She played the violin and the piano and taught voice and those kinds of things. And she was the one that prepared me. I was to go to Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee. And she assisted me with the learning of my song for that symposium, music symposium. So I sang in German, in English, and French, the beiden Grenadier. Wow. And at that symposium, I did not get honorable mention. My voice teacher said, "Why are these kids from just the cities getting the scholarships and honorable mentions? You were better than many of them. And I'm going to take you to another school." Now, Lane College was not a bad school. Lane College is where Alex Haley attended, who wrote Roots, the series that appeared on television a few years ago, many years ago. But she got me in to sing for John W. Work, whose name is associated with a number of spirituals. in this country, probably 1,000. And he heard me sing, and he said, you know, I'm about to take the singers to Europe, but I want you in my group, which was highly unusual. The group, usually you got into that group maybe the second year, but I was the only freshman that was singing at the time. I don't know what's happened since. But I was able to sing with them for 5 years, because my 5th year, after I graduated in my 4th year, my 5th year I was living and working in Nashville, and they invited me to come back and sing again. So I sang with them for 5 years.
Wow. Had you heard of the Fisk Jubilee Singers before deciding on attending Fisk University?
I had not. In Humboldt, Tennessee, again, which is very small, while there was one like radio station, you know, it played basically country music in that small country town, and rarely featured anything classical or folk or spiritual. So I had not heard of them. And I became even more fascinated when I found that their history was steeped in something that I had been interested in.
Wow.
It caused me to think, this is where I belong. John W. Work also had gone across the South recording songs sung by the enslaved. And when I knew that that connection existed, that gave me increased interest, that the singers were actually a group pulled from the larger choir. There was a man named George White, and he was a white man. He was at Fisk in 2 roles: to direct the music, the choir, and as chief financial officer. Related fields, of course. but he taught the big choir the related hymns of the day, usually from Europe. You know, Aramus Dei, all of those marvelous big anthems from Europe. And he heard some singers singing under the magnolia trees in the afternoon after class. And he rushed out, "What is this you're singing?" And they said, "Secret, sacred songs from the old days." Fisk had been started as one of the education centers to educate freed blacks following the end of the Civil War. And it started in 1866. And like a number of the other schools that were started in those days, Fisk was beginning to get into financial difficulty. And now keep in mind, I told you that he was the chief financial officer for the university. He said, "These sound great. Let me put you on the program for one of our concerts and see what the audiences think." And at first the students were reluctant to do that because they knew that their why they were secret, and that they had some messages in them and so forth. But the war was over. So he finally convinced them to tack one or two of those songs on the end of the concert. They sang them in and around the Nashville area, and the rest is the history. The pattern of tacking spirituals onto the end of any choral concert or vocal solo concert started at Fisk. Just to test to see if audiences would enjoy spirituals.
Wow.
And they did. So he got 9 of those students to become the singers on tour, because he couldn't take the whole choir. The school was losing money. And he went in 1872. He brought the group on tour to a number of places. The first stop was Oberlin, Ohio. The group did not have a name. And he named the 9 the following night after they gave their first concert, the Jubilee Singers. And he said that he'd had this dream about the Year of Jubilee it comes from a biblical passage in Leviticus that states that Jubilee, the Year of Jubilee, is the year that the slaves were set free. That is the relationship. And so they became the Fisk Jubilee Singers, went on tour with carrying the spirituals, some classical music that he had been teaching the larger choir. And they were invited, because of the name, I think, more than anything else, to sing at the World Peace Jubilee in Boston in 1872. And this guy that was directing this big event, his name was Patrick S. Gilmore. And he was a flashy, showy guy. But he had the Fisk Jubilee Singers to stand in the orchestra pit to sing the 3rd verse of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. This wasn't a spiritual. It was related to slavery. And if you want to know more about that at some point, we can talk. But the Battle Hymn of the Republic was the song, and they should sing the 3rd verse. Well, the director of the choir, now keep in mind, the Coliseum that they built in Boston was a 100,000 seat Coliseum. 100,000 in 1872 on the Back Bay area. They'd put in this huge pipe organ and now to show you, when I say huge, one of the pipes was a 43-foot bass pipe.
Wow.
That's pretty tall, I would think. You know? Now, the Coliseum was so big, and this predates all of the technology that we have now for sound. So people speaking from the stage sometimes could not be heard from various places throughout the Coliseum because it was so huge. The director of this 1,000 voice choir decided to give the pitch for the song, and he pitched it too high.
Oh no.
And the choir was just in disarray. The Fisk Jubilee singers stood in the orchestra pit. When they came to the third verse, they sang it to perfection.
Wow.
The audience was in an uproar. The Jubilee singers were brought from the orchestra pit to the stage for a second rendition. So their career was really launched not from the singing of the spirituals, but for the singing of the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Wow.
So, please go on.
We're going to shift gears a little bit. What
Sure.
are some key words or phrases from the secret sacred songs in order for communication?
Just a few examples.
Mm-hmm.
In Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Coming for to Carry Me Home. Now, that is one of them. And we know that it was created, not composed. None of them were composed, but created during the last 30 years of slavery. Because the second verse makes reference to meeting the conductors on the Underground Railroad. And that was angel, the word angel. Now, when you look at the verse, it reads, I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? A band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home, carry me to freedom. Mm-hmm. So the words were just a single word within the second verse. If you were to look at a song like Wade in the Water, Wade in the Water, the entire song is a code song. This is if you are on the Underground Railroad and you are being pursued by possible captors and they have bloodhounds, then what you need to do is to wade in the water, because the bloodhounds then cannot get your scent. Mm-hmm. So that entire song is a code song. Let's see, what else? Oh, some of them were rhythm songs, because in the fields, if you got behind with your work, everybody could get beaten. And so they felt that it had to be a team effort to get them to catch up. And so some of the songs were, the code was in the rhythm. Oh, wow. So that you would, the faster you would go, the faster you are supposed to either harvest or whatever, the preparations that they were doing in the fields. The whites did not want to believe that these codes were included, even after the war, when there was a lot of decoding and some notes were being put to the music. They didn't want to believe this was true. But there were codes. Mm-hmm. Follow the drinking gourd. Yeah. Another. One of the most fascinating songs, I believe, for a variety of reasons. I find it fascinating because there would have been assistance from whites in developing the song. The abolitionist that assisted the slaves to escape actually had to have assisted them on several counts. One is that the slaves did not understand the night sky. And they needed for them to, the abolitionists needed for the slaves to go north. And so they had them to follow the drinking gourd. The drinking gourd was something that was in every slave's household to dip water. A gourd with one half of it cut away so that you could actually scoop up, drink. So they knew that. And so they said, look to the sky. Can you see where there is a drinking gourd? And apparently they said yes. And they were able to follow the drinking gourd. That song gives the time that they should depart. So it gives a timetable. When the sun is high and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. When the sun gets high, when the sun gets highest in the deep south, it's fall. Follow the drinking gourd. That's when you leave. When one river ends, another begins. Follow the drinking gourd. When the Tombigbee River comes to an end, you're near the Ohio River. Follow the drinking gourd. The north sides of the trees the moss makes a real fine road. Follow the drinking gourd. And then who should you meet? Peg foot, left foot. Follow the drinking gourd. It's fascinating. All of those cues. Today, white people will say, they've created that. They didn't. It's impossible that they could have been, and some of them with large degrees would still be wandering around in the South trying to find their way out. But those slaves were able to use those cues and get out of the South.
Wow. Was the reference left foot, peg foot, was that a real person?
That was a real person.
Wow.
Who had one leg, and the other leg was a peg leg that they put on because they did not have the advancement that they have now for prosthetics.
Wow. So, other than oppression and slavery, what were some reasons that the North was appealing to African Americans?
The North was appealing to African Americans for a variety of reasons, has always been. During slavery days, that was the route to Canada to get to freedom, with Canada being under the United Kingdom. Once they got, and the United Kingdom was already furious with the colonists for separating from Great Britain. And most of the resources across the U.S., they lost all of that. So they were furious, and they vowed to save any slave that got away from the U.S. So the North was appealing to the slaves for that reason. After slavery, the North was appealing because of the possibility of jobs and a better way of life than in the rough life in the Deep South.
So shifting gears a bit, will you tell us a bit about your role with the Red Cross Chorus? When and how did you become involved with that?
With the Red Cross Chorus?
Yeah.
Surely, I am not just out of the water started the choir. Wherever I have worked, I've created choirs. I did in some difficult situations like Vietnam. and what to the point where I was able to get the general to agree for me to get a musician that was going to go to combat, and to play the music for the choir. And we built chapels in Vietnam, and my choir performed there. But when I was at national headquarters, there was no music. I said, this to me, I just don't understand this. We were approaching first holidays, and there were no singing of carols, or it was, to me, it was sort of dull. Everybody could do their jobs, but didn't seem to be any esprit. Mm-hmm. And so we started this choir that just sort of bloomed, and did well for more than 30 years at national headquarters in Washington, D.C. Wow. And we sang for major functions, board meetings, and all staff events, all across the city. Didn't travel because that would have been very complicated, since some of my choir members, like, was secretaries for the president of the organization, and the like. They just couldn't, leave town to sing. Right. But that was a marvelous experience. Wow. And I received a national award for that, by the way.
Wow.
National Leadership Award for creating that.
It's amazing. I know that you've traveled with your organization to give many performances and presentations, but is Martha's Vineyard the main location of the U.S. Slave Song Project and its members at this time?
Yes. This is our home base on Martha's Vineyard. I personally have given presentations, I could almost say now, all over the world. And I really did enjoy those presentations in Africa a lot, because of the relationship to knowing about the door of no return, for the slaves and all of that, and my relationship directly to coming from a family with the legacy of slavery. So that's been very key. But in Brazil, I had a chance to give a presentation in Salvador, Bahia, one of the early places, although the very first slaves came in at Recife, Brazil, but then they moved into Salvador as being the key location and point of culture. Still today, it is a point of culture in Brazil. Then of course, all over Africa. I did also in Jordan. I had a special assignment for the International Committee of the Red Cross in Amman, Jordan, and gave a presentation there. King Hussein was the king of Jordan in those days, and he would fly his own helicopter over to the site where we were located. We were located in the King Hussein General Hospital. We thought we were going to be in a MASH hospital unit, and when we got to Amman, we went to Amman because there had been planes hijacked to the desert, and through history you can determine that this did happen. There were planes that were hijacked to the desert, and there were Palestinians dying in the streets of Jordan. And I flew over as the representative for the International Committee of the Red Cross with a full military MASH hospital unit. That included about 30 vehicles. The leader of the Palestinians at that point was Yasser Arafat, and then, of course, the King of Jordan, King Hussein, had to agree. All of them had to agree that we would be safe if we got there, and we did. Drive 30 vehicles through the streets to the hospital. And he said, you don't have to put up any tents. Just go into the hospital was brand new, but it hadn't been outfitted with beds and so forth. Well, we had cots and all of that, but we were going to have to put them in tents. Mm-hmm. And so once we got everything all set up, occasionally we would have the Jordanians as well as the U.S. troops to have presentations in the evenings. And that was a remarkable setting to give that. So yes, in Jordan, in Sweden, where little white kids would run up and put their hands on my face and ask me if this came off. And I'd have to confess that no, it's there forever. And then my hair, they found fascinating. Oh. Because it was so, it wasn't straight and long, and, it was short and curly. So they found that fascinating. And I gave a concert there in Glasgow, Sweden, in the church. Wow. That was quite an interesting event. Mm-hmm.
So other than Jordan, are there any other experiences or performances that stood out to you that you want to talk about?
That I wanted to, all of them. I feel, yeah. There is always something. I try to have most of my presentations where there can be an interactive phase, because people are so interested in these. Once they get to know that there were more than religious statements, mm-hmm. that while these slave songs are sung primarily now no, they aren't. They're shared broadly in white churches now, as well as, because I've gone in white churches and heard them sing Amen. Michael, roll the boat ashore, Cinnamon. But to think that the slave songs were born in the white church is an interesting concept, but nobody ever talks about it. Mm. And it's true that the slave songs were actually born in the white church. The slaves had to accompany the slave owner and his wife and kids to church to take care of their needs, including serving a meal. And those slaves that sat in the back of the church watched and listened. They had a need to communicate, and they wanted to explain to people when they got home what they had seen and heard in church. And in this attempt to tell them, some of these songs were created, like Ezekiel saw the wheel way up in the middle. They were fascinated by those stories from King James. I mean, it's some of those stories still fascinate me. You know, what were those wheels and what were they doing up up there in the air? Angels ascending and descending on ladders from the sky. Jacob's ladder is the way they memorialized that. Later, we are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing on. They were fascinated by the pageantry of the church. They would see the priest march in this long white robe. I got a robe, you got a robe, all God's children got a robe, is the way they memorialized it. When I get to heaven, I'll have my robe, and I'll walk all over God's heaven. They would see the priest wearing this thing that looked like, to them, a crown. They would they would create songs about starry crowns, all of that. And so I found those things just fascinating. And that they were created first in the white church. But they were created for people working in the fields and back at the big house so that they could tell them what they had seen and heard. Now, singing those things across and raising questions with people in other lands is very interesting. Very interesting indeed. Again, back to Sweden. I was there on a home study visit, and I was there at the same time Dr. Jerome Kern, who was black and had been chosen to go there, go to Sweden as the ambassador. The Swedes were just bereft. They just did not understand why, if you put down blacks in your own country, why do you want to send them to us? Why are you sending us Dr. Jerome Kern? Are you angry? They thought that the U.S. was angry because Sweden allowed the peaceniks to come into Sweden during the Vietnam War, or they allowed anyone who did not wish to fight in Vietnam to go to Sweden. We had a very interesting conversation one night there in Sweden because this director of the Red Cross for Sweden needed to get 2 vehicles to a camp for the handicapped. And I told him that I would be happy to drive one for him. He clutched his heart. "You can drive?" he said. I said, "Yes. Probably was driving before you were born." And he was just amazed. I said, "You have to sit down. Let's talk." And so I mentioned these songs again as the root which started my concert in Sweden. Because he felt then that others needed to hear these stories and hear these songs. Because he went into his study, had a huge study, and brought out the books that he wanted people to see. And there was Jerome Kern. Jerome Kern who was supposed to be a famous musician here. And there was another composer of the songs of the South who wrote Old Black Joe. carry me back to old Virginia and my old Kentucky home. And he said, that's the image that I have of black folks. And then he said, I have a TV, which was rare in Sweden in those days. But he had a TV. And he said he had seen the rioting of blacks in Los Angeles and at the Chicago National Democratic Convention. And that was his image of black people, not understanding why they would be protesting. And so we had to have some conversation that, in fact, the enslaved were not only smart, in many cases, they were very smart. Over my head, I hear music in the air, one of their songs. And that indicated either, depending on who was in the room, it would indicate that they heard the angels singing, which would be the conductors coming to get them. They would sing, keep your lamps trimmed and burning, which meant if there was a lamp in the window, that was a code for the slaves, there was a safe room, and they could spend the night. You know, there were all these really fascinating things that's in these songs. If people actually knew the real history, many of them they just sing them thinking that, and they confuse them with gospel music. Right. You know, all of the gospel songs were composed and came after the Civil War, period. None of the slave songs were composed, and all came before the Civil War. Yes, all came before the Civil War. The last one was either "O Freedom" or "Great Day." Great Day, the Righteous Marching. And there has not been a new one since. There have been some composed songs created for, like films, like the film Harriet, that had a couple of songs. Harriet's Farewell Song was one that was created using the type of modes from the period. And they've done an excellent job. So that isn't a criticism of that. It's that sometimes people confuse the ones that are authentic with those that are not.
Wow.
Most of the gospel songs are written in major keys. Most of the slave songs are in minor keys. Most of the original slave songs, by the way, can just be played on the black keys of the keyboard.
Wow.
I find, which, you know, that's an interesting thing, because of the pentatonic scale, which is a 5-tone musical scale.
Wow.
Now, they did all of that just carrying that knowledge in their brains. When they were captured in Africa, they didn't have an opportunity. Let me get my instrument. Hold on for a minute. You know, they didn't have an opportunity to do that. They had to try and recall. And that's why there's so many variations of drums from Africa. They learned that the slave owners learned that the talking drum, which is a squeezable kind of thing with long strings on the side, but it's a talking drum. They knew that they were sending messages when they were beating the talking drum. But they did not know that there were messages in the songs. But in Africa, it's commonplace to sing almost everything. Messages, births, deaths, histories, all of that is sung. So it wasn't that complicated for them to transfer once they got here. The whites just didn't understand that.
What do you look forward to and hope for the future of your organization?
You know, I'd like for it to continue even when I'm gone.
Mm-hmm.
It would be good if it could continue, at least the message to continue. Maybe you can continue it, Allison. At least some of this knowledge. I don't know what you're going to do, whether you're going to plan to teach or if you're going to leave this research behind. However, if you get this work and this research done so that it's available to others to learn about the days, and that the slaves were not stupid at all. They did what they had to do to survive and did it well. And here we are.
When performing and teaching about the spirituals, what is the main message that you hope your audience members take away?
That the slaves were shrewd. That they learned how. For an example, if they were singing, the songs were really for the other slaves, to tell them that there was either danger, or to tell them how to escape, or to follow the night sky, or, important stuff. But if they were singing songs about freedom, that scared the white slave owners. And so they would transfer words as the slave master would walk in the room. For an example of any song like "Give Me Jesus," they would be singing "Give Me Freedom." And if the slave owner walked in the room, freedom became Jesus. They had that capacity. That's smart. And it saved their lives.
Yeah.
That's what I want people to understand. I think that maybe if people would get to know each other better, it would help. I oftentimes I think about that period that went into the Civil War. There was a song that became the rallying cry for the South, to give them spirit and to make them think about the old days that they had in slavery and that they wanted to keep forever. That song was Dixie. I don't know if you've ever heard it.
No.
But you've never heard Dixie?
I don't think so.
You've never heard Dixie?
I don't think so. I think I've heard of it. But...
I wish I was in the land of cotton, where old friends are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. You've never heard that?
I don't think so, but that was amazing.
It became the rallying cry for the Confederacy.
Oh.
Now, do you know who composed it?
No.
Dixie? 2 former slaves.
Wow.
Now, here is the irony and the paradox. In Maryland was famous. That's where Herod was from, remember? Maryland. Well, there were 2 slaves set free. And they moved to Ohio. And in that community in Ohio, there were just communities of white people. I mean, they couldn't find anybody suitable, quote, for marriage, because it was illegal to marry out of your race in those days. So they wished for their old friends. I wish I was in the land of cotton, where old friends are not forgotten. Look away, look away, Look away, Dixieland. Okay. Makes sense so far, right? Then there was this man who ran minstrel shows in New York. And I can't remember Dan's last name, but his first name was Dan. Dan had relatives, his in-laws, lived in the house next to these two former slaves. And the former slaves sang weekends at what then was called a little roadhouse. Now you would call it a little cafe or pub across the street from where they lived in Ohio. They taught Dan this song, and he took it up and added it to his minstrel show in 1861, and the war started. The Southerners loved it, and it became the rallying cry. What paradox! So I want people to know stuff like that. You know, that did whites ever have a spirit? I know of one spiritual that is called a white spiritual. And it's done so well that even one of my great professors had gotten confused, thinking that it was created by blacks, and said so in some of his writings. But it's Jesus Walked This Lonesome Valley was a song of Appalachia. And there were a lot of people in Appalachia, poor whites, that assisted blacks on the Underground Railroad. So there was a parallel, and some of them got to hear the blacks singing quite often. But Jesus Walked This Lonesome Valley is a white spiritual. So if there is a legacy at all, I want it to be greater racial understanding. Because the more of this kind of information in history that looks at certain issues and see the way certain problems were even started, I think it can ease certain frustrations held and felt by certain racial groups. That would be the greatest legacy I could leave behind. I just love to see that.
How do you think we can use history and knowledge about the sacred songs to create meaningful change and work towards a more just world?
I just think that people need to understand, if they would just take time to understand each other, and their backgrounds. When people just want to hate on the basis of the color of someone's skin, it's ludicrous, to have that kind of thing in this day and time. We've got this small, fragile world to share together. I was thinking the other night when we had this large piece of space junk hurling toward the earth, and saying, "Oh, where will it hit?" Well, I think, 70% of the globe that we share is water. That means 30% is inhabited. And our little tribes are rushing around on 30% of the globe, frustrating each other for what reasons? because we don't look alike, maybe we should all go to the beach for a few days and and trust. Sorry, that was a joke. But, you know, if you can look at it from that perspective, that it's a small, small world that we need to share together. And the more we just listen to each other, it refreshes our understanding of each other and the world we share. It does. It does. It doesn't mean that one race is smarter or richer or poorer or anything because they choose to live the way they live. Some is determined by where they were born, you know? I look at people who live in the tropics. It just seems like they're so laid back. Why not? Why not be? They didn't have to build a huge brick structure in order to keep warm. They have warmth year-round. I look at people in the north. If they don't have a brick structure, they won't survive. They have to have those huge, warm structures in order to survive. It doesn't make them smarter that they created them. We're all born the same way, and we all leave the same way. Anyone who wishes to return to tell me what it's like on the other side, I might be willing to say they are superior. But no one has done that. So I want to just live. I want everybody to understand that we're all in it together, and we all share this fragile earth, this fragile globe, together. Less than 30% of it, and no one is superior to the other, regardless of the resources that they have. So if anything that I can share can assist with that understanding, I think it can reduce some frustration.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas, thank you so much for being here. We truly appreciate your time with us today and sharing us your stories and your knowledge. We're so lucky to have you on Martha's Vineyard. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Allison.